Welcome to Words on Words, a podcast presented by the University of Nevada, Reno Writing Center. Hello, and welcome to Words on Words. For this episode, we're joined by Scout. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Scout.
Well, my name is Scout. I am also working at the Writing Center. I'm a materials engineer major, so probably not what you're used to hearing about. I'm a junior, and I've been here. This is my fourth semester working at the Writing Center.
Oofta.
Fancy.
I know, I love it.
So fancy.
I'm becoming a top dog.
Grizzled ancient of the Writing
Grizzled ancient. How do you feel being called a grizzled ancient?
Honored, I guess.
The focus of this episode is to discuss the importance of peer review. So in your classes, when you're required to read a peer's paper, this could happen in like English classes, this could happen in maybe core humanities classes. I know it happens in like fiction workshops and poetry workshops and stuff like that. And you'll probably see it happen, I've had it happen in history class too. So you'll run into this a lot. And so our podcast is to focus on that peer review kind of from all sides.
Yeah, and whether you're part of a peer review group for a class or you're paired with one other person, there's a lot that you can gain from the peer review process.
A lot of students struggle with the peer review process since, especially as freshmen, we might not have enough confidence in our own writing to feel qualified to comment on someone else's writing. But the point isn't to correct grammar and catch run-on sentences or anything like that. There are plenty of things you are very qualified to kind of comment on. So, like, aside from required areas that you might find on a rubric, I know some people you have to comment on an introduction or you have to comment on how well the conclusion works. What are other kinds of stuff that you can and probably should comment on in that peer review?
Well, stuff that you could comment on and should is really any higher order concern, whether you think a specific paragraph maybe isn't organized effectively, specific sentences don't make sense within that paragraph, maybe they should be moved somewhere else. All of those really higher order concerns relating to thesis should be, or organization, should be commented on, and I think you should feel comfortable having a conversation about that. And again, like what you were saying earlier about how people don't feel qualified for or to comment on these things is a real problem. And I also find that when I've witnessed other people peer reviewing is it's not really a conversation happening. It's, I'm going to read your paper and write notes, when I think that peer reviewing requires conversation, much like we do at the Writing Center, in order to effectively explain why I wrote what I wrote and why I feel this way, so they actually have meaningful feedback. If you're going to comment on a higher order concern, it can be hard to say, this paragraph doesn't make sense, and have them interpret that. So I think the biggest issue is they just lack the communication during the process.
Well, I mean, I think one of the sort of essential parts that we at the Writing Center like to highlight throughout our process is that we're a kind of a peer-to-peer sort of environment. While our consultants have a certain level of expertise in their given field, they don't proclaim to be sort of gatekeepers of grammar or sort of, knowledgeable within their specific field.
Right.
And
so we even aren't considered like experts. We're not. We're not experts. We're not your professors. We're not tutors, which we always say consultants instead of tutors, because tutors implies a sort of authority that we just don't have. So really the Writing Center consultation is essentially a kind of
mini peer workshop.
Yeah, like
really.
a one-sided mini
Right.
peer workshop.
Right. Yeah, it's that's sort of how we envision whether we're in that setting or whether we're in a group setting for like say 100J or whether in some cases we're bringing people, we're sending consultants to specific English classes to facilitate workshops. There's a certain sense of like, okay, yes, we're not like the arbiters of like grammar. We're not the people who have that, like, we're not like the gatekeepers of what's right and what's wrong. Instead, we're here to have a conversation. And Scout, you mentioned that you really enjoy things like peer workshops and especially within an English context. Like, what is it about peer workshops that you're sort of drawn to, and how do you help to facilitate that conversation that you were talking about?
And what makes a good kind of conversation, or what makes a good peer review?
I think the most effective kind of strategy used when I would accompany those peer workshops and kind of talk about how we peer edit was really making sure that everyone was comfortable. And we kind of always emphasize rapport building in the Writing Center because you can't really have someone trust you or you can't review someone's writing before they trust you. They have to be open to share that stuff. And I found that was very true in the workshop, because everyone in that workshop is tense, they're vulnerable, they don't really know their classmates. I never talked to any of my classmates, and they're afraid that if they comment on something harshly, then that same comment could be made to them. So it kind of creates this like overall timid feeling. So what I found is by like reading a paper out loud to everyone and asking if they're comfortable with it, and then asking each person like, how did you feel about this paragraph? And really kind of allowing for that open space where it's okay to make mistakes. And because I'm kind of not in that position with them, when I say it's okay to make mistakes, I find that eases them. I'm like, well, this is how I felt about it. Does anyone else have conversation? So just kind of building up an open conversation about papers is what makes peer review stronger, because when you have that open conversation, they're more willing to write meaningful feedback, and they're more willing to admit like, oh yeah, I should have written like that, and they're more willing to just be vulnerable, and vulnerability leads to better feedback and better communication.
Right, and that's I think part of the struggle with doing peer reviews in class is that either you're paired with someone you never talk to, so you have no experience with this person, you don't know what they're like, you don't know if you say, oh, you missed a comma here, I think you're missing a verb or something, they'll be like, oh my god, I hate you, you're so mean. Like, I think
you're not my real dad.
You're not my real peer reviewer. But I think it's a very legitimate concern, and I mean we all have our own insecurities about our writing, and we almost don't want like anybody to point it out or any of our peers to look at it. So I've been in a few of the kind of same class workshops that Scout's been in, and it's very, very quiet.
Yes.
No one wants to say anything. If they do say anything, it's like, oh, your introduction was good, or I liked your conclusion. It's not really what peer review is supposed to be, and peer review is really supposed to be having someone else, kind of what Scout was saying, having someone else look at your paper and give you those. Really, I mean, even if it's just reader responder, like, I found this sentence confusing. Like, that's really helpful, and you kind of have to go into it under the mindset of, I am getting just how someone else is reading my paper. It doesn't have to be a reflection on you as a writer. It could just be, oh man, what a dumb typo I made. Like, I'm glad you guys, like, I think you found I put marital instead of Marshall
yes.
in one of my papers. Is like, oh, good thing I did not submit that.
Marital law.
Marital law. I mean, that's the thing, not what I was talking about. But it's just getting that other kind of look at it. And so that other side of peer review, kind of segueing into that, is how to use that peer review. So assuming someone did give you really helpful comments, they let you know if sentences were confusing, or maybe they had a comment about organization and they thought that how you organized the paper was confusing. How do either of you kind of incorporate reader feedback or peer review feedback? Or how would you recommend that someone kind of go through and pick out important stuff? I mean, obviously you don't need to include every single thing that everybody commented on.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is, especially when you're looking to implement peer feedback, a lot of it is knowing when to kind of keep their advice and when to like forego it for like the sake of the style of your writing or for the sake of the point that you're trying to make. Because ultimately it's about prioritizing like whether you think that they have a good point that they're coming from, right? Like they're and ultimately not to really take the tack of like, you know, they're not attacking your, you know, the soul, like your very soul or your very like essence by, you know, by being like, oh yeah, a comma needs to go here and not there, or you need to reorganize this section and maybe consider sort of reappraising this other section. It's instead looking at, does it operate towards like what your overall intent was, and does it assist like the way in which you're writing is sort of trying to capture that point, I guess.
Right. I think kind of building on that idea is audience is a really important factor of that. So, for example, when someone says that maybe this doesn't make sense, maybe that person you're peer reviewing with isn't the intended audience anyway. So maybe it shouldn't make sense to them, and that's not a big deal. And that's kind of one way to factor out kind of maybe non-essential feedback, is kind of defining whether their opinions are the people that you're trying to reach or things like that. But otherwise, I think it's really hard to incorporate a lot of feedback without that communication. And the only thing I would say to help that is really try and understand why they wrote the things. You know, if you understand why they thought it was confusing, then you can look at the why and make your own judgment call, whether it's essential or non-essential.
So that could be another thing. So when you're in peer review, for kind of the benefit of your peers and ideally for you, it would be adding those explanations, or
Right.
at least having, if you don't have to already, have some sort of cover letter or end letter or something where you explain either this is a really technical subject, so I didn't quite get it. If your audience, as you were saying, Scout, if your audience is within that field, then this is probably fine. If you're aiming for a more general audience, then you might want to rethink kind of how you're phrasing stuff.
Or at lieutenant audience.
So one thing that peer review is also helpful for is kind of learning how to edit your own work. So while you're reading kind of someone else's paper, you realize maybe, oh, I don't have a thesis statement, or it could be, oh, I'm missing like a good hook for my introduction, or maybe my thesis isn't as strong as it could be. So part of that peer review process is kind of learning yourself what to look for in writing and how that works. So for either of you, if you've been in peer review or things that maybe you've seen in workshops that we at the Writing Center have done, what kinds of things do you either see in papers that you peer review or anything like that, kind of outside of the Writing Center, that you then find that you can take in your own writing and kind of make it useful? Because I think that's a big concern for students, is that they think that this is just a waste of time. They're like, oh, I'm going to read, I'm going to put commas here, I'm going to say, oh, you have a thesis, great, nice conclusion, and then move on.
Good job.
Good job, stamp of approval. When it really could be incredibly helpful.
Well, the engineer in me, well, whenever I get any kind of peer review or anything, the engineer in me is always like, why? Why is this the way it is? Why are you saying this? Or then when I'm reading a paper and something doesn't sound right to me and it might sound off, I'm always like, why doesn't it sound right? Why isn't it effective? Do I do that? And that's kind of how I become a better writer and become a better at everything I do, is I always question why, and I always am prodding and poking, trying to find those answers of why. So and the most common error, I think, in those peer review workshops I do, especially for some of the English classes, is having warrants of your text. So the warrant is when you have research that supports your thesis, but you're not quite combining why that research is relevant. You're just saying, here it is. And if they all have the same paper, so that all the students participating in the peer review have the same paper, I find that's a really common theme, and that's kind of a way to improve yourself, is just noticing that, like, oh, why did you write this piece of research? And again, questioning why. Why is this relevant to your thesis? Do I say that? And that's really how you become better in your own writing, is always just questioning why. Why?
Yeah.
We need to make that t-shirt, the plus comma why question mark. But that is true. So even if you get comments back and someone just says, this is a really confusing sentence, like, I mean, you can ask yourself why.
Right.
So look at it again. Maybe you realize that you have the wrong word somewhere where you meant to have, oh no. Or perhaps just the structure of the sentence is weird, where you have like clauses appearing randomly and you don't know why. But you can still ask why of those comments. I mean, you might even have to do that with professors. We'll have another podcast on how to deal with professor comments.
You don't. You just burn your paper and that's it.
That's not the right attitude. But you can always ask that of the comments that you see on your own paper. Don't be discouraged by the peer review process. So you
Be encouraged.
Be encouraged.
Don't be afraid to create an open dialogue between you and your peer reviewer during the session. You know, it's supposed to be about communication, and it's hard. I think the best form of communication that we all understand is verbal. You know, it's easier to explain why you find a sentence confusing, so don't be afraid to go in depth during peer review. It doesn't have to be a quiet room of hearing just pencils click clack on papers. You can talk. And I encourage it. I think it's just helpful for you, helpful for the other person, helps expand on ideas and understand the why through verbal communication, you know? So do that.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think it's essential in the peer review process to not just look at the superficial aspects of someone's writing, right? It's so easy to be the copy editor in a peer review workshop, such that you completely miss the idea of what the paper is about, or like the intent of the author. Instead, look at the the undergirding ideas of what this paper is about. Like how is this person communicating things like why. It's so important for those ideas to be solidified, and then you can get into the kind of grammar stuff later on. So.
Awesome. And on that note, we'll go ahead and bring our podcast to a close. Thank you to Scout for joining us in our discussion, and thank you to you, our listener, for joining us as well.
Yes, thank you.